Hello there. Today I'm taking you through the double welted pocket or back trouser pocket. It's a simple starting point that we're going to start with. Well, yeah. First I'm going to explain the things or the pieces that you'll need, and then I'm going to go over the process in stages, right? I'm also going to show you how I made this flap. However, you can get creative with it, do something you want to do. But we're going to start with the double welted pocket, and then later on we're going to move on to variations. So you're going to keep this in your back pocket as we move on to different types of pocket. You want to start with a strip of fabric which is 19 centimeters wide. This will simplify cutting the pieces for you. You'll need two 19 by 30 centimeter pieces for the bag, one 19 by 10 centimeter piece for the bearer, two 19 by 5 centimeter pieces for the jets or welts. Which I cut perpendicular to the bearer because that's how it's done for grain and pattern related reasons. Not so important while we're practicing technique, but keep it in mind. For your trouser piece, it needs to be 21 centimeters wide minimum, and more than, I'd say, 15 centimeters tall. Mark the center point of your trouser piece and mark the point 1 centimeter on both sides of it. Then measure perpendicular down 8 centimeters from the center point. Mark the lines going from this 8 centimeter central point to the 2 points you marked on either side of the midpoint. Point. Ugh. You'll sew the dart you've just created closed, and then you'll iron it down so that it's pointing towards the side seam of the trouser. But we don't have one of those, so you can just iron it down either side for now. Every time you've finished a machine stitch, I want you to get into the habit of snipping the loose threads immediately, instead of leaving them. Having done as such, at the bottom of the dart, mark a 15 centimeter line perpendicular to and centered on the dart. Now we're moving on to I've got a few options we can use. Well, I have two options, but if you want to use fusing, I suppose you can. I have what's called linen tape or pocket linen or something, and I also have canvas padding. They're not essential should you not have them, but they're used to stiffen the pocket opening. I am using my linen. I am basting it on the inside where the dart is showing. Center it and baste it on the line that you chalked out. Now we are moving on to the jets. Should you wish, you can put canvas, linen, or fusing over half the jet. The half close to the pocket hole, by the way, and you'll end up with significantly stiffer welts and a stiffer pocket. It doesn't have to be done, but it can be should you wish. Your basted line will be a few centimeters away from the pocket hole. As you baste those, make sure you copy the chalk line marking the edge of the pocket onto the jets, so that you can still tell when it comes to machining them. Lastly, the first pocket bag. It must be centered on and run parallel to the dart. Baste it onto the trouser near the top and bottom. Now we're ready for the It's important that you are precisely starting and finishing where the pocket hole starts and ends. Or at the very least, start and end your stitches such that they end on the same vertical plane. Cut your loose threads and remove all of your basting so far. Now cut open your pocket hole. Start in the center, make a small cut such that you can get your scissors in order to cut a straight line. Stop at least 1 1/2 centimeter away from the edges of your hole, because we're cutting a mitre, basically a triangle. Move the jet out of the way. Do not cut the jet. Cut very precisely to the edge of the machine stitch. This allows the welt to lay straight. Before we move on, mark 1 centimeter above the bottom seam of the lower welt, or jet. We're going to iron this up. Start with either one of the jets, turn it out through the pocket hole and spread the seam open and iron that. Now this isn't my ironing board, by the way. This ironing board is so bad that I may as well take a shit on the floor and smush my ironing onto that and iron it then. But c'est la vie. Fold out your second jet and do the same. And apparently it's easy to undo the ironing you just did on the other seam when you do the second seam. I haven't made that mistake yet, miraculously, so just lay the second seam against the edge of the board with the first dangling off of the edge, and you should be good. Once we've done that, we can move on to one at a time. Begin by rolling the loose end of the jets over the seam that you've just ironed flat and basted in place. Done right, the basted welts will touch but won't overlap. You don't want any gaps either. And if you did your seam allowance right in the first machining, they will be 1/2 of a whole centimeter each. Proceed to baste your welts together. You want to do this so that when you sew the mitres down, your pocket won't be skew-if. They'll be perpendicular and parallel, and you won't have made a pocket in the shape of a parallelogram. Alright, rhombus, which is a parallelogram. And it generally keeps them together while you're doing the rest of the pocket. With everything sealed in place, start with folding away the trouser such that you can machine the welt onto the pocket fabric. There's no set seam allowance or whatever, so just as close as you want, I suppose. Do the same with the other welt, and we'll move on to the mitres. Fold them out and make sure you're pulling them taut, and folding the trouser fabric out of the way taut too. Make sure the welts aren't overlapping but are touching. Sew them together at the absolute base of the triangle, practically on the same line as the trouser is folded back. Go over it at least twice. You want to completely skip this step for your first and maybe second pocket. But regardless, you want to remove the basting. Closure-wise, you could leave it blank and it'd be a perfectly functioning pocket. Or you could make a tab and sew a button to the exterior of the pocket, or sew a buttonhole through the exterior here and sew a button onto the other side of the other pocket bag and bearer, or you can make a flap. There are no set measurements that I'm using except the width of the pocket hole, so I made it 15 centimeters wide plus my seam allowances. I decided I wanted 4 centimeters to be exposed, and then I added another 4 centimeters above so that it will be completely and securely held when it's sewn up. Since I would do a buttonhole for this, except I lost my gimp thread, I also cut some canvas interlining to go inside of it. I would use the canvas anyway, because otherwise you just have 2 pieces of your fabric, and that's not very significant. I sewed the two pieces of the flap together, trimmed the corners so that it could be folded inside out cleanly, shoved the canvas in there, which maybe I should have pasted on to one of the sides of the flaps before sewing them together, maybe. I chose to prick stitch the edge to seal the canvas in place, for decoration and to keep the seam flat. You're a tailor, you should be doing that too. Whatever you're using as a closure, all you do to seal it up there is position it where you want it, state it with needles or with basting, fold back the trouser and stitch in about the same place as you did to keep the welt in place. If you did something or didn't, the next step is on the other pocket bag. You ought to chalk out a line 2.5 centimeters from one of the short edges, so that you have a reference point to sew on the bearer. And speaking of the bearer, mark 1 centimeter from one of its long edges and iron that up. Position the unironed edge against the chalk line of the pocket. Baste them together near the ironed hem so that you can fell them together. Then you'll fell the lower jet that you already ironed onto the other pocket. Be sure to move the trouser out of the way, or at the very least don't sew through it. Ordinarily, you'd have an entire trouser to fold away in order to get the pocket bags together. So, you ought to baste the pockets together in order to keep them in place. When machining the pocket, there are a couple of options you can use. You can bevel the corner slightly, very slightly, which you can use to get a crisp right angle. Or you can make it curved so that you're not losing lint in the corners. And there's another that you can use, which I'll go through for the single welted pocket. I beveled it. Snip away the edges so that there aren't any seams when you French it. Trim down the edges so that there aren't any seams still flapping about when you French it closed. When you fold it inside out, make sure the stitches you just did are right at the edge, practically showing, and that they're not folded slightly one way or the other. One thing you can do is roll and push the seam to the edge, making sure it's centered and basting it as you go. You could also use a needle to pull at the threads, pull it out to the corner. And it's important that you're pulling the threads, not the fabric. If you pull a piece of the weave, we've got problems. Maybe not with trouser pocket fabric, but if you're doing it on the lapel of a jacket, Sew your pocket seam closed. Remove basting if applicable. Now we're going to close the top of the pocket. It's no different if you have a flab or a tab. You're just pulling the trouser out of the way and sewing about the same place as the other 2 times you machined the top of the seam allowance and welt. We're basically just reinforcing the miters and the edge of the pocket. According to professionals, the back pocket is the pocket under the most stress. So I'll take their word for it, even if I don't use my back pockets for anything. The most difficult thing about this, I've found, is drawing good and symmetrical Ds. And you're just prick stitching them on both sides. There are other things that can be done, such as using a bar tack machine, but we're tailors. I'm sure we'll get to other possibly more interesting things in time, but for now, D-tack it. This could be done before you sew on the second piece of the pocket fabric on, and the D on the inside, which is often a messy affair, will be hidden. Try both. Try one at least. And that's your back pocket all done. Do as many samples as you so choose, maybe starting with the basic ones to begin with. Then later on after that you can move on to getting creative with flaps and tabs or something. See you in a fortnight.